Greetings and welcome to Chapter 10, Interpersonal Communication 120. Let's jump in. While I'm getting things set up, please get out your book. You should have it open to page 312. It actually starts on 311. And let's get started. So what we're taking a look at, let's look at some essential questions. These might help you to think about some things to write about. So ask yourself as you're reading this, what are the 4 dimensions of intimacy? How does gender and culture influence intimacy? What are the fundamental characteristics of family communication? Describe the analogy of a family system as a mobile. Okay. Note how conversation and conformity shape family communication. Understand Chapman's love languages. What are Gottman's 3 conflict styles in romantic relationships? What are the 4 types of relational transgressions? What role does gender play in how we communicate with friends? And what does research indicate regarding the influence social media has on friendships? So those are all the things that you should be able to answer when you're done reading the chapter. So let's start off. The book starts right off with intimacy. And stop just for a moment and think about, what is your definition of intimacy? What was your first reaction to the word intimacy? Okay, so let's talk about what it really is. And it's multidimensional. So the dimensions are physical intimacy, right? Which for most people, that's the first association when they hear the word intimacy. But there's also intellectual intimacy. There's emotional intimacy, shared activities, and group discussion. So there are several things. Actually, the last one, group discussion, is that's not a shared intimacy. That's not one of the dimensions. But what I would like you to think about, I would normally have this group discussion if we were meeting face to face, is which of those dimensions do you think there is one that's indispensable? So different people will answer that question differently. And also, it depends very much on the stage of life we're in. So is there one in particular, and you might want to think about writing about this in your summary, that you think is indispensable? Okay. So let's look on 312. And that's exactly what the discussion is on 312, is all the different levels of intimacy. And, when you dive deeper into it, I think it's interesting to explore what you think, what dimension of intimacy you think is absolutely necessary or indispensable. So when you talk about physical, of course, that's your sexuality usually, but it's also not just that, it's also, just touch and affection. Okay, so thinking about how well you know yourself. Intellect, right? So that is that idea that you can really get wrapped up in a deep conversation about many different subjects and really talk deeply about them. It doesn't have to be like emotional subjects. It can be political subjects. It can be things about the planet. It can be a lot of different things. But that intellect and what that's like when you connect with someone intellectually, emotionally, right? So thinking back on chapter 4, all of our emotions and what emotions, how they express themselves intimately. Okay, shared activities is also a level of intimacy because it involves some vulnerability and the taking risks on whatever activities you'll be doing. But they generally, shared activities, even doesn't even have to be really fun things, like you're thinking about shared activities like a sport that you might do together, cooking together, right? But believe it or not, people find satisfaction and a sense of intimacy even when they share the chores at home. So activities is a broad category, but sharing in responsibilities is absolutely a shared activity. And all of the any kind of shared activity that two people are participating in, especially just willingly doing so, has the strong possibility of creating bond or deepening the bond or reestablishing a bond. All right, let's move on. Okay, so this idea of intimacy, I want you to take this is not out of your book. It's actually from one of my favorite books. And just think about, what does intimacy really mean? Your book does definitely talk about a realistic view of intimacy. And it talks about how, we shouldn't expect any level of intimacy to be all the time. And I love this quote from Anne Murrow Lindbergh. You may or may not be familiar with Charles Lindbergh, but Anne Murrow Lindbergh was his wife. And you should look it up. They have a very well-known history. She wrote an amazing book called Gift from the Sea. And she says it in a really beautiful way, but your book also says it this way as well, just with different words. She asks the question, what is intimacy? When you love someone, you do not love them all the time in exactly the same way from moment to moment. It is an impossibility. It is even a lie to pretend to. And yet, this is exactly what most of us demand. We have so little faith in the ebb and flow of life, of love, of relationships. We leap at the flow of the tide and resist in terror its ebb. We are afraid it will never return. We insist on permanency, on duration, on continuity, when the only continuity possible in life, as in love, is in growth, in fluidity, in freedom, in the sense that the dancers are free, barely touching as they pass, but partners in the same pattern. The only real security is not in owning or possessing, not in demanding or expecting, not in hoping. Even security in relationship lies neither in looking back to what was in nostalgia, nor looking forward to what it might be in dread or anticipation, but living in the present relationship and accepting it as it is now. Relationships must be like islands. One must accept them for what they are here and now within their limits. Islands, surrounded and interrupted by the sea, and continually visited and abandoned by the tides. So another way to think about intimacy, what I like to say is, it's really another way to say intimacy is into me see. So all of the categories that we explored, they all provide this level of this possibility for vulnerability, right? Which is to let someone see into you, into me see. Okay, so that's my definition of intimacy. And it's so healthy to develop the right, accurate, realistic expectations about how intimacy moves and flows. And, it ebbs and flows, just like Anne Murrow Lindbergh says. So what about masculine and feminine intimacy styles? Well, according to your book, feminine, with someone with a feminine gender role, intimacy is usually through self-disclosure. Okay, which I know I can definitely say that's been my experience. I'm someone who identifies with a masculine gender role. Intimacy through shared activities. Bonding occurs through whether that's a romantic partner or good friends, or usually with the male gender role identity. Intimacy is through shared activities. That's how people start getting to know each other and loosening up. What about communication in families? So families is very complex, and how communication works in a family is very, very complex. So that is what we're going to unpack right now. The characteristics of family communication are that family communication is formative, okay? So what that means is it's formed from your original models of communication. So that's usually your parents and then other relatives, siblings, and relatives that are around you in your lifetime when you're forming your communication styles and expectations. And also, there's this idea that your book talks about having to do with attachment theory. And it's a really, really good theory. It's still very well supported by scholars. And basically, the theory says that how you attach to your parents does shape you for the rest of your life. So, and does have a tendency to have an effect on your security or insecurity. So, if you grew up with a parent who wasn't very affectionate and not too touchy feely or not very intimate, that is a kind of a faulty attachment, because as humans and especially newborn babies, we are it's innate in us to connect physically with our parents, to be physically on and with our parents. And so depending on the level of attachment in your early life, it tends to lead to more security or less security. And that's not a fixed aspect. If you have observed yourself as insecure, it's a matter of asking yourself, taking the, uncovering what's underneath your insecurities. It's very much not permanent when you say to yourself that you're insecure. It's not permanent, but you know what else isn't permanent? Security. They both ebb and flow. And but to be more secure obviously creates healthier uh, attachments with people. So the other aspect or characteristic is that your family communication is role driven. So one example might be your birth order, right? So you play a certain role based upon your birth order. So unless you're an only child, you were either first or middle or youngest, okay? Or depending on the number of kids in your house, right? So the way your birth order is very much an influence on the role you play in your family, and the role you play in your family directs and guides your communication. So if you're a middle child, for example, you might think to yourself, middle children have common characteristics. And so you might identify as a middle child, right? Or the last born, the baby, the youngest. You might identify, and your role will be very different than, say, the firstborn. Okay. The other thing is that family communication is involuntary. I mean, you can't not communicate. You're creating and teaching one another how to communicate, and it's involuntary. Okay. And let's see. Okay. Okay, so your book talks about, I wanted to talk a little bit more about family communication is involuntary. It says that you have the freedom to choose friends, dating partners, but you don't choose your parents, siblings, or other relatives. Even if you take the drastic step of cutting off communication with some relatives, their influence is likely to persist. Okay, so the web of involuntary family connections grows even more complex in adulthood. Okay, and then the book talks about how that complexity is even more so because in adulthood, one might marry. And so the person, let's say the wife in the relationship has her family, right, that she grew up with, and then the husband has his family, and then the married couple are creating another family. So it's really three families. So it's very, very complex. And that's what this means: involuntary, extensive, and three families. Okay. Also, family systems are interdependent. So you grow up again with your roles, and everybody's depending on each other to do something in the family. That could be the obvious things like chores, and like parents go to work, kids go to school, things like that. But it also can mean that you're interdependent because of behaviors. We form habits based on behaviors. So if one of the siblings is as a bit like maybe bullying, or maybe a sibling that's very jealous, it creates this interdependency, not a very healthy one, but how you interact with each other and how your relationships are is also going to create interdependency. Okay. Hierarchy. So generally in a typical nuclear family, it's the hierarchy starts with the father, and then the mother, then the oldest kid, and then the next oldest kid, and so on. And so mood states tend to trickle down in a family. So that has an influence on how the family is at that moment. So if a parent comes home in a bad mood, they've had a rough day or bad traffic, and they're in a really bad mood, you can even stop and think about your own experience, and maybe consider writing about it in your summary. That what happens is one parent comes home, they're in a bad mood, and it tends to trickle down or be contagious. Remember, we talked about emotional contagion in chapter 4, and the way that so not only is it contagious, it tends to trickle down. And so when you get to the youngest person, they might not have anyone to take it out on. Maybe they take it out on the dog, but hopefully not. Okay. And then the other aspect of families families, so this idea of a family as a system, you can start to visualize using certain examples. And so families are nested, and they consist of subsystems and suprasystems. Okay, so the super system is the overarching system. If you think of a system like, I'm trying to think, like your house is a system in a way. Your whole home, it's put together with so many different things. And so the supra system would be your home, right? The subsystems of the home would be the windows, the doors, the air conditioning, the heater, the different rooms in the house, the kitchen. So I don't want to go too long on that example. I just want to give you a picture so that you can start to understand that the family is very much built the same. So you have the super systems, which are usually the adults. They're in charge, they're running everything. And then the subsystems are maybe one layer is the oldest kids, and then the next layer after that would be the younger and the younger kids. But you have these subsystems. Okay. If you wanted to take that to a bigger degree, we could start with grandparents or great grandparents and move down into the systems. So that's how then this idea of nested is supposed to look. Your book talks about the Russian dolls that are put together such that as you each one you open up, there's a smaller one inside of it, all the way like 10 layers down to the smallest. So this point, the take-home message is that families are more than the sum of their parts. Okay, so when you put all of these pieces together, right, you have more than just this one, like the house example again, more than just the house. You have all these subsystems in it that make it run and that dictate how a family will operate and run. So with that, let's look at page 322, communication patterns within families. There's several different types. And I would love it if you would write about which type you identify with in your summary for this chapter. Okay, so families, this idea of communication patterns is about halfway down the page on page 322. And it says what families talk about is common and unsurprising. Reports on activities, logistics, shared events, and so on. But how families communicate, can vary significantly in two ways: modes of conversation and levels of conformity. So conversation orientation relates to how open families are to discussing a range of topics, okay? So conversation orientation, a little bit more. Think about so there's high conversation orientation, right? Where if families are oriented this way, they interact freely, often, and spontaneously, and it's quite different from families with low conversation orientation, where many topics are taboo and others can only be broached in a restricted way. So there's more on that in your book, but I just want to give you the overview of conversation orientation, okay, and conformity orientation. So the idea of conformity orientation refers to how strongly a family enforces the uniformity of attitudes, values, and beliefs. So you have high conformity families, which they manage communication in order to seek harmony and avoid conflict, right? Foster interdependence and gain obedience. Obedience is the key word. They are often hierarchical with a clear sense that some members have more authority than others. Okay, very important. And to ask yourself if you can identify with that. All right. And let's see. So if you look on the top of page 324, there's a really nice table that helps explain conformity orientation and conversation orientation and how they are in relationship to each other. So look at the top. I don't have that graphic in my slides. So I'm depending on you to have your book open and be able to look at figure 10.1, where you see a set of boxes like a table, and you have conformity orientation. And if you have high conformity orientation, you have consensual families. If you have low conformity orientation, you have pluralistic families, okay? And then with a high conformity orientation and a high conversation orientation, that's how you end up with a consensual family. If you have high conformity orientation and low conversation orientation, you have protective families. So I would like to actually just go into the definitions of consensual, pluralistic, protective, and laissez-faire, okay? So in a consensual orientation, okay, families tend to, I'm going to put this more in my own words than to look at the book because it's making me not talk very smoothly. So consensual orientation in a family communication pattern is where decisions are seen as needing to come to a consensus to make a decision. Okay, so that's where there's a lot. Let me see if I can find a quote from the book. It says, families that are high in both conversation orientation and conformity orientation are consensual. Communication reflects the tension between the pressure to agree and the pressure and to preserve the hierarchy of authority. So in families in high conversation orientation and low conformity are pluralistic. Communication in these families is open, unrestrained, so not a lot of boundaries, and all family members' contributions are given merit. So, and then families with low conversation orientation and high in conformity, they are protective. So communication in these families emphasizes obedience and authority. And I'll let you read the rest of that one. Families that are low in both conversation orientation and conformity orientation are considered laissez-faire, which roughly translates into hands-off. So so I like to use the case, I think your book actually talks about it. Like, let's take an example, getting a piercing when you're a teenager, okay? Or maybe I think the book talks about a tattoo, but either one. In a consensual family, you would have to yield to authority. So there won't be a lot of flexibility as to talking to your parents about getting a tattoo or a piercing. Okay. In a pluralistic where communication in these families is open, unrestrained, and all family members, in that case, a discussion about getting a tattoo might also involve your siblings, not just you and your parents. In a protective family, you are definitely probably not going to get a tattoo or a piercing. That's low conformity orientation and low conversation orientation. And it's just, that's the final word. It'll just be no, and no is a complete sentence, right? So in a laissez-faire family, you probably wouldn't even think twice about getting a tattoo or piercing, nor would you consider even asking your parents. So I personally was raised in a laissez-faire upbringing, and I literally did go get piercings without my mom's consent and lied about my age. And my mom didn't say a word about it when she found out. And so those are things you can reflect upon. Like, where do you think you fit in that? And how really the best reflection you can do in your summary is to pinpoint who you identify with, the types you identify with, and how you see that how that played a role in your communication style today. That would be the ultimate for this chapter entirely, is to discuss that very thing. Of course, sex and gender and friendship play a role in your communication style. So we have same-sex friendships, right? We have cross-sex friendships. We have friends with benefits, and you also have to have gender considerations in here, right? Like gender roles and sexual orientation. So communication differs, and like you can always think about your same-sex friendships and the way you communicate and what level and how deep you'll go and subjects you will share, right? Versus cross-sex friendships. So cross-sex friendship might sound something like, I'll use my own example. I have a guy who's my best friend. His name's Steve. He's my best friend. And where I benefit from him is I want to hear the male point of view. I really do want a balanced idea of when I form my opinions. And so I will often get his feedback because he's a guy. So that might be something some of you can relate to. And friends with benefits, I'm just going to leave that with you. It's different with different generations, and it often can be a complete disaster. But also, that's something that if you have any experience with, or just your observations of your peers, you're certainly welcome to share your point of view on that. So communication in romantic relationships specifically. The triangular theory of love by Robert Sternberg. And actually that same graphic is in your book and will look a lot better if you find it in your book. And so, now I'm not finding it in my book. Hold on. Okay, it's actually on page 334. Nice graphic. So the triangular theory of love recognizes love with some basic dimensions to it, 3 of them actually. And so at the top is intimacy, then at the bottom are passion and commitment. And so this figure, it says that depicts 3 components or corners of a triangle and identifies 7 possible combinations resulting from their intersection, right? So if you have the top left intersection, it's intimacy and passion, which equals romantic love. If you are on the top right of the triangle, it's compassionate love, which combines intimacy and commitment. So then if you have the left corner, then it's passion alone, which is infatuation. Okay. Also, if you have the whole purple area, then it's fatuous love, which is passion and commitment. And then at the right-hand corner, you have empty love, which is being committed to being alone. Okay, so let's move from there and look at communication in romantic relationships in terms of couples conflict styles. And so I'm not going to say too much about conflict, only because I'm going to talk about it a lot more in chapter 12. But your book talks about 3 dimensions. Okay, one is volatile, one is avoidant, and the other is validating. So if you look on page 338, volatile, these couples have intense, heated arguments, sometimes over small issues, and I'll let you read the rest of that one. Number 2, avoidant, these couples who use a style they prefer to ignore issues. And then thirdly is validating, kind of the perfect world, where these couples openly and cooperatively manage conflicts. Okay, and so again, just a time to pause and think about what if any experience you've had with any of these conflict styles in a relationship. And then on page 338, they talk about Gottman's ratio, which I think is really interesting, and I've actually had some personal experience with it. But so Gottman's ratio says that, let me find, okay, so it's on the bottom of page 338. And the gist of it says, he calls it the 5 to 1. 5 to 1 is his magic ratio, okay? And it says that as long as a couple have 5 times as many positive interactions, such as touching, smiling, paying compliments, laughing, kind words, and so on, 5 times as many of those as negative ones, they are likely to have a happy and successful relationship. It's easy for avoidant couples to keep the negative number low, as it is for volatile couples to keep the positive number high. So the key for all couples, including validating partners, is to maintain the appropriate ratio. So basically, when you're in a relationship, it's this consciousness and awareness to try and put effort into having there be 5 times as many positive inputs as negative ones. So there could be a long list of what a positive input is. Those are just a few examples in the book, but it can be doing some chores around the house. It can be a lot of things can equal positive inputs. It depends on your partner's love language, which we will get to in the book. So this idea is, the way this can be really practical in your communication is that if you have to have a difficult conversation with your partner, something that your partner does, a habit they have that's really getting on your nerves, for example, if you're going to want to, you've decided you're going to have that conversation, the way to improve that communication would be to make sure that your ratio is pretty decent, like that you before you sit down to have that conversation, that you've given some positive inputs before actually doing that. Because when you have to have a difficult conversation with your partner about something that is getting on their nerves, your nerves, it's negative. It's going to be received as negative. And so it's really helpful to use Gottman's ratio when you're having a conversation like that. But it's also just helpful to use that ratio to have kindness credit in the bank in your relationship. So that's something that people have to consciously choose to make an effort to do. And then you have Gary Chapman's love languages. And I think they're helpful. I'm going to leave it to you to read the details of them, but I think it's really important for you to read them and decide which one of these is you. Or it's also possible that you're a combination. So we don't have to get really linear about it. Okay, you could be a hybrid, but in general, he categorizes 5 love languages. One being words of affirmation. So that's somebody who needs to hear encouragement. Somebody who really thrives on being encouraged. I can definitely relate to that. Quality time. That is someone's love language of quality time, means that they feel a lot more love when they're spending time with their partner in quality time. Some people's love language is receiving gifts. I know people who love to receive flowers, for example. So receiving gifts. Some people's love language is acts of service, like when you do something for your partner that your partner really benefits from you having done that. Okay. So, meaning like, yes, it could definitely be everyday chores around the house. It could be something that your partner normally does around the house, but you do it as an act of service, just to be of service to your partner. But some people's love language is acts of service. For other people, their love language is a lot more influenced by physical touch. So again, physical intimacy. So it's very helpful to know your love language. And if you're in a relationship, it's really helpful to know your partner's relationship, your partner's love language. But also, this is specifically referring to romantic relationships, but all of your interpersonal, your close interpersonal friendships would benefit from knowing what each other's love language is. So you can also write about that in your summary, but that does bring us to the end of chapter 10. Thank you very much.